All right, this is an update to the Expo Idaho proposal from Gardens of Xanadu, and it's meant to provide a little bit of information related to where we're at and some more specific information based on the individual projects that will be proposed. So first of all, if you're unfamiliar, we're proposing down at Expo Idaho an adjunct to the park that's going in. It's a 90-acre park. It's in process. The company Port, which is out of Philly, is involved in putting that in. They were contracted with Expo Idaho and to Ada County in order to come up with a plan. And the reason that we're proposing this is not to compete with them in any way, shape, or form. It's actually meant to augment their plan and hopefully get more community involvement because it addresses some specific things that we think could be brought in that, given the budget and the time, Port is just, it's unrealistic for them to be expected to do something like that. So, in a nutshell, the Gardens of Xanadu project down there is a multi-experiential space meant to immerse and engage our community and those visiting Idaho. Now, that's a pretty heavy markety term, but it's a pretty good encapsulator of what it is that we're looking at. It's definitely multi-experiential, meaning there are three different huge aspects to this. We'll propose what those are and actually outline them in this slideshow. And it's meant to be immersive and engaging and cover kind of a gamut of things that just aren't feasible given the budget and time. And it's meant for everybody. The nice thing about this proposal is it's entirely community. It isn't like an individual entity. It's also not meant to come in and like take over space. It's meant to be a lease agreement of the land, which keeps it Ada County. And it's meant to be for people visiting Idaho, as well as those of us that have lived here forever. So it's pretty comprehensive. So a little bit more specifically, it's three unique spaces. They're going to be clustered together. At least that's the proposal. And it'll be within a 10-acre section. 10 acres sounds like a lot. It's really not for what we're proposing. And it's also meant to be part of the entry corridor into the greater park. That allows for people kind of coming into the 90-acre park from the Expo side. To be clear, this is all Expo, but the park is a little bit now separated. And it's the entry point for that so that people can choose to go into the Gardens of Xanadu, or they can choose to continue into the greater park. There are a number of other ways into the park, but this is the one adjacent to the Expo Idaho inner area that people are most familiar with. So the current process here is, again, Port is involved in developing a plan. They're pretty far along on that. They've had tons of meetings. This is not meant to disrupt them in any way. There's also no commitment to this. I want to be clear that while the community is proposing this and we keep trying to see what might work, we don't want to interfere with what's going on because that's not helpful to anybody. They're under, like I mentioned, budgetary and time constraints to get something done. And so what we're trying to do here is just carve out a lease agreement that would allow this effort to work in kind of in tandem, but also in autonomy so that it doesn't disrupt or require any money from any of the agencies currently contributing. So we're proposing a land lease. I mentioned 10 acres. It may shrink or grow depending on what is suitable for the area. We're trying to get an outline that's a little bit more helpful to, again, the placement, what it would mean in terms of delivery of utilities, things like that, and then very specific data information that would be along the lines of deliverables so that people could understand what it is that's going in and how long it would take and what that's going to result in after the 2 to 3 year period of deployment. So right now, we're currently fielding developers. Those are developers with the understanding this is a community project. It's not meant for developers for any sort of other project involved in this, meaning there's not going to be any proposal for condos or anything that's not against or that is against the public interest. So what we're looking at is entirely community altruistic and meant to serve us as the population. Now, what it does is it actually adds some missing components. There's a few things in the major park plan right now that we think that we could help with, and as a citizen initiative and kind of an adjunct to this, while not interfering, and that is some income to pay for the maintenance and future potential additions. The way the plan is outlined now, and I encourage you to go look at it, it's called the Park at Expo Idaho. They show a current process, which is very helpful. That actually does not outline how it's going to be paid for to maintain in the future. There are 11 sports fields, 5 sports courts, an all-wheels park, a playground, a lot of trails, a ton of planting arrangements that have to do with our indigenous species in different zones in Idaho where they grow, and some bridges and things like that. So that's a lot of infrastructure to take care of year after year. And so our hope is to bring in something that helps pay for that so there's no taxpayer burden. It also enhances the performance and experience spaces adjoining the grandstand. Currently, the grandstand is being slated for upgrade, and that's because the very popular summer concert series and some of the other things that come out of there are a great boon to the Expo Idaho. So what we're kind of thinking is, well, what if we had an indoor year-round tropical garden performance center adjacent, but just enough away to where, it didn't interfere with public gathering around the grandstand, but adjacent enough to where it could augment that by having a winter, early and spring, late fall type of scenario as an available performance. So this would also allow for more diverse types of performances. As opposed to a concert, you might actually have a lot of theatrical performances or philharmonic or anything that fits in the traditional stage performance. And then in addition to that, you could add more concerts and music venues and things like that. The nice thing about this too is that it's meant as an autonomous space, which I'll show you a little bit later, but it also can blend into the garden space, which then doubles the amount of personnel that can fit, or people that can fit in that area. So it also adds, this project does, it adds a lot of cultural, artistic, and science, as well as tech and makerspace stuff. This doesn't exist in the current plan, and of course that's a tall order because you can't meet everybody's expectations all the time. It's just really difficult. But with this plan, we add a lot to that. There's a whole bunch of stuff that gets added here and generates its own revenue to pay for itself and pay back into the community, as well as pay for future. So it's looking at it as a win-win-win situation, we hope. And that was one of the key ingredients that was mandatory here, is it had to be a win for everybody, and not a burden, or it wasn't likely to work. The other nice thing is that in these spaces there'll be a constant change of venue, so that people are constantly engaged. You want them to come back, you want them to see something new, but you also want them to participate. So it's fully community. People can get involved in just about anything associated with, and that really does mean everything. There's the nonprofit aspect. How do you start a nonprofit? How do you run a nonprofit? What does a nonprofit actually mean when it comes to community? There's the B Corp aspect that we intend to do, and that's because you want to make money in a B Corp, but you want to make sure it's for the public benefit, and that's what this space is all about. There's some LLCs that need to come in here, and that's because there should be a restaurant. So some of the food grown out of here goes into a restaurant that people can dine at, brings in a little extra revenue. A coffee shop makes sense here, and some wine and beer as well, but those need to be run slightly separately. So people might want to get involved in what are those, how do they work, how do you start them, how do you do the finances. Then, of course, there's all the stuff that happens at the space. People might want to get involved in the theater aspect, or they might want to get involved in the LED coding, or any of the botanical offerings all the way through. And this could be K-12 through adult, through retired. So we're really hoping that this fully engages everybody and offers something for people to be involved in, and even new ideas, and help fund those ideas so that this creates a consistent churn of engagement and brings people in and out of the space all the time. So again, the Park at Expo Idaho is a great place to go look at the current plan as it exists. That way you can get a familiar idea of where the layout of it is, what's going in, and what Port, the organization that's working with Ada County, is actually putting in. So our current plan, this fitting into the current plan, is, again, we want to make sure it's a lease agreement, doesn't complicate or hinder the process. We want to make sure that it augments Port. We're hoping that Port sees this as something that they can incorporate into their portfolio if that makes sense to them, because we're here to empower the success of this project in whatever way. and not compete with or interfere, especially because we're not another organization. We're a citizen initiative. And so we just want to make sure that Ada County benefits, that the Expo Idaho benefits, and that Port benefits. And most importantly to everybody, that the community and all of Idaho benefits. And for that reason, we're willing to work with whatever boundaries are feasible. I mean, there's going to be a lot of, as with government, there's a lot of rules and regulations. So that's why we think a lease agreement and just some deliverables in that lease and safeguards to ensure that we actually do what we say, or we get, yanked out of the lease. Those are all kind of in process here. The intent is we need to self-fund this, right? This has to be entirely paid for, entirely self-funded as it perpetuates, but more, it needs to pour money into other things, people's salaries in the region. It needs to pour money into Expo Idaho, into grant opportunities for new ideas and all kinds of tech and art initiatives, and also to help pay for the maintenance of the park. So this is a very, very basic overview, and there are some more extensive research numbers that go along with this, so that if people want to look at them, and the developer that we choose will want to look at all of this, of course, but we think it'll cost 12 to 15 million to build. That's stripped down from the very ridiculously large project that we were proposing originally. This was never intended to be as large as it kind of ballooned into, just for clarity. People got really excited and they started drawing bigger and bigger visions of this. And we started to see the feasibility of the actual structural engineering scaling up. So it got pretty giant. But on that note, it could actually be stripped down even more. Like, this could be shrunk down to something that could be done for about 6 million and still succeed. Anything lower than that, we think that it won't succeed, or it will clunk along and it'll just, it'll be less than spectacular, and people just will be disenchanted with it, which will cripple it. Now, it'll cost roughly $3 million a year to operate. That does not take into account other variables that might come into play, because we want to present this as realistic and not just wishful thinking. But if we have a lot of volunteering and donations and things like that, that cost will go down. So those are your, how much does it cost to build? How much does it cost to operate? Now, the revenue estimates that we have are fairly conservative as well, and meaning like 4 to 6 million per year for the botanical gardens. If you were to look at botanical garden comparables around the nation, for example, your eyes would get really big, you'd get really excited, but I caution you strongly. I do want people to go look at this independently, but when you see a $300 million income for, a botanical garden, that is super unrealistic for our area. It is just out of proportion. It does give you an idea of how successful these are. They are, to a park, very, very successful. But we need to be realistic about Idaho and where this is at, and this is new. It's also, we're talking about a tropical botanical garden inside of a dome. Specifically, I'll go over this a little bit later, with some display gardens around the area. But we're not talking about anything as extensive as some of these botanical gardens that exist elsewhere. The close comparable would be Denver. I'll go into that in a little bit, but again, that's way, disproportionate. So, and again, so $5 million a year for the Adventure Series. I'll describe what the Adventure Series is here in a moment. So we think that's a very conservative estimate that's realistically achievable, that has the potential to be much greater than that, but that way it gives us a very baseline number. 2.5 million-ish a year for the performance domes. Those are kind of hit and miss. And honestly, I mean, you could have a 0 year for performances. Look at COVID. So those are a little bit iffy. We wanted to make sure that we compensated for that in other ways and just allowed that to roll in. It could be greater than that as well. I'll show you those numbers, or at least some of the projections on that. And then you've got the 500,000 to 2.5 million, kind of a big range there because it's a new idea. That is global, and people can subscribe for $7 a month globally. I'll describe that a little bit later as well. So that number could actually be much, much larger. I mean, depending on, we're talking, 8 billion people on the planet. Let's say, 3 billion of which have the means to join. But of course, that's an unrealistic number too. So, and we didn't include retail. There's a lot of sales that go along with this. There's a lot of For example, the coffee, wine, beer restaurant, and any purchase items like art or swag, which would be like a t-shirt or a hat or whatever, plant sales, all of that kind of revenue that comes in from that stuff is not included in these estimates because, again, they're variables. While I can calculate some of that, I feel it's easier to just default to the bare bones and then be much happier with what comes in. So let's talk about the individual domes. You have the Gardens of Xanadu, or GoX Adventure Dome. So this dome is kind of described in best as an interactive art space. There's a similar concept to this. There's actually quite a few. These are spaces that are fairly popular in terms of you go in and there might be light shows or blacklight forests or all kinds of interactive, things that you could go through that are hidden doors, for example, that lead to slides or whatever. So those are similar concepts and they're measurable against the revenue of those spaces. There is a new concept to this that I'm introducing. It's not entirely new, but it is compiled from a bunch of things that are interesting, and that's the Adventure and Mystery series. I'm going to omit a little bit of detail here because it is proprietary and it is new intellectual property. So I don't want it copied right away until I get that in the, into the copyright and also agreed upon by all the parties that it is protected intellectual property. Same thing with the Illumiversity. That one's pretty easy to describe, and it is protected because I have it artistically copyrighted. And that is essentially, if you look at the egg in the picture, all of the lights should be codable. So people that want to play with that, all the light coding, whether it's on this sculpture or on any of the 3 or 4 other sculptures we have planned, the drone sky shows that are possible here. And what it is you can subscribe to be able to code the lights on those and create your own shows. That it can include to music, because we kind of want to pair this with music artistry. So you have the music and light show all at once. And that could be live. We are looking at inviting the Philharmonic down to the current version of this that we're building and playing a few. It'll only fit about 4, maybe 5 string instruments inside. And then from there, we intend to code the lights to a show that goes around that. So we think that concept might take on, and globally, people would be able to see perimeter cameras in their own concepts, which means a subscription. Makerspaces are pretty known. They're pretty popular. It may not be that there's the makerspace necessarily at this facility, but it would be an adjunct one so that people could bring in their makerspace items or classes or events to this space for display. And again, science and tech classes are sort of built into this, as are exploration and showcases. It's just something that comes out of a space that's bent on artistry, tech, and science kind of merged together. So for that reason, we think that there are likely to be about 250,000 visitors per year. That number is pretty small. It might seem daunting, but Port's proposing that over 1 million visitors come to the park every year. And again, these spaces are fairly well documented throughout and how much they should be priced at. So $20 a ticket. A comparable would be Meow Wolf. They make $12 million a year per location. They've opened 4 locations for that reason. They do very, very well. Again, it's not a Meow Wolf. It's very different, and it has a number of other concepts. So that number, we've shrunk that down to be conservative, but we still think that it could perform on that level pretty easily in the future. The Illumiversity is $7 a month per type, so 4 different things listed there. That would be 4 options for your $7 a month. Each that would be a $21 outlay for if you wanted all 4. But it allows people to play with the light coding on these sculptures. That doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. It's not an option, so it's a new thing across the globe, and it doesn't require any additional outlay. There's a tech component to that that's a website and some cameras and the sculptures, but those are already being built anyway. So those do not have comparables because they're new, and therefore they weren't included in the math. We think that we can probably bring in a certain amount, but we're not entirely sure what that will be. So in the next dome that is in the center, you will have the actual tropical gardens. Now, these are fairly well established. The Victorian era, these used to be very popular. They don't have to be a dome. We just really like the structure. Buckminster Fuller structures are the strongest architectural current structures. So they're very easy to build at scale and extremely easy to keep clean and transparent because they shed water without certain valleys or crevasses that might end up with debris. You do have to do some maintenance, but that's also being built into it. Now, the nice thing about the tropical garden is it's not just a bunch of plants, which I'm pretty fond of. I think it will be really cool. But you can actually look at building on the west and east sides of this on the inside and possibly on the outside for exiting on a hill. But you can build kind of hiking up, right? There's a 60-foot elevation gain to this dome. And so that gives you a lot of rise up. So you could hike up a fairly steep 60-foot elevation gain and then go across the sky bridge to the other side, which would be at the same level, and then down. Likewise, on the outside, you could have 2 egress areas that are at that 60-foot level, or people could enter at that level and go across the sky bridge. So it's just sort of an in and out experience. I'll explain how that would work because, of course, you have to pay to get into the space, but because it's all within the 10 acres, that does make sense. So there's some elevation gain. And then in the middle, you could have a park. And that's nice because, in the middle of winter here, it's great to have a transparent dome, look out over the moon and the stars, or, during the day, the sun, and have a park experience that is still quite warm, 80 degrees, 75, 80 degrees down there in the park. So in addition to that, it should adjoin the performance dome, and there should be an aperture that could be opened so that if you have a concert, especially something that's a danceable concert, you can spill the population out into the garden park area. That allows for increased capacity with some safeguards around the planted areas because stompy feet and beer and wine don't mix well on foliage, but we think we can protect that. So there's some design plans to incorporate the spaces and flow between them. Now, these spaces are year-round. They're also, because the park is inside and the elevation gain hiking trail, I put 40 feet there because that's more realistic. There's a 60-foot elevation gain of the dome, but on the sides it's going to be down a little bit. The other thing is, besides the canopy bridge, is the lightning storms that can happen. You can put lighting across all of those steel beams. They'll be steel, tube steel most likely, because that's the most structurally sound. And so you put LEDs across that all the way on the inside, and you can do these white LED flashes across the dome ceiling, making light shows, lightning storms. It does have to rain in there. You need wind to simulate some outside conditions, so the trees will root more deeply. So if we have an evening or a nighttime tour of these, it does allow people to experience some pretty fun effects when it comes to a lightning storm spectacle. There should be botanical programs and educational programs, all kinds of science around this, all kinds of volunteer or public experience that they can come in and help plant some of the arrangements or compete with each other in terms of what's on display. And the average visitors in this space would be around 250,000, which is the low end, to 500,000 visitors per year. Again, that's based on national comparables and our area. So 250,000 was what we went with the lowest, at an average ticket price of about $12 per person. And that doesn't include the event pricing that could be associated, for example, if people were to have weddings in the outside grounds or other types of receptions or events that were held, it would be additional revenue. Now, the Performance Center, as you might imagine, is just a stage and some seating or standing area for people to move. And so it's fairly straightforward, although we think we should design the center in a couple of ways. One, there's a couple of theaters throughout the world that are quick set change type of stages, meaning an elevator goes down a little bit below the stage, and then you can move the previous set off and the new set on very quickly within 45 minutes is where I've seen it done at Angus Bomar Theater. And then the elevator comes up, the pieces get moved and bolted into place, the lighting is already and sound are already set up, and that allows for roughly you can do up to 3 shows a day that are completely different that way. I think that's aggressive, but it's possible. The capacity at this point for a theatrical production or a concert would be 500 to 750 people. That isn't a lot of people in terms of larger concerts. That's true. But if you opened it up into the botanical garden side, you could add an additional 400 or 500 people to that space pretty easily, possibly more than that. That does depend on fire code. And that depends on aperture size of the exits. So that number could be much higher. I went really conservative with it. And again, the changeable stage type and seating type. So the seats should be there for things where people are obviously going to want to sit and watch a theatrical performance, or you might want to remove them and have the ability to dance and move around freely. So these should blend into the available spaces. The average ticket sale for something like that is $45. And the average shows per week at a very, very low end would be 3 shows per week over a 40-week period. As you know, there's 52 weeks in a year. So that leaves, quite a bit of growth potential there. Also, shows per week. I mentioned you could do 3 shows a day. I think that the growth needs to be there for that. I think that is hitting the mark way too high to plan for that. So I put this really conservative for that reason. Now, the outside space, we were looking at 10 acres for a reason. We want it to blend in with the natural flow of the park entrance and into Expo Idaho. We also want to make sure that the gardens around the domes are able to be display gardens as well, so people can be hiking around and moving through trails that are within the enclosed 10 acres of this particular park. The reason that it would be enclosed is you would want to pay for entry fees into the park and then move freely within that space. Now, this shouldn't preclude entrance into the greater 90-acre park, right? That should be a flow by the 10-acre space so that you're not obligated to go in here. But in order for us to bring in revenue to pay for everything, and in order for these unique and more expensive by far programs to be paid for, you do need to have a cost entry type of scenario. So 10 acres we felt was adequate to that. If there's more space available, we feel this could grow quite easily, but it would depend on what Expo Idaho really wants for their future, what it makes sense for the community. And by the community, I just mean the people of Idaho, and how we feel about it. We do think that being flexible here is a good idea because it could definitely grow into something much bigger. The community gardens should be on the perimeter, so there's no entry required, right? So that we just sort of nurture those and safeguard them, but they aren't inside the perimeter. Maybe in we call it a DMZ zone in cybersecurity. So I'll just refer to it as a DMZ, kind of a in-between space that's maybe a little protected, so people can't just go by and harvest from the community gardens, but people can get in without going into the greater space. And then, of course, we want to do community food to come out of these spaces. We believe in planting a bunch of stuff that could be produced out of here and then given to community needs, but also for the restaurant and other spaces that might avail themselves of that food production. The entire thing, including these gardens, should be about education, research, and collaboration, and just in general, the population here and what people really love and benefit from across the board. So here's some simple dome specs. The domes are 120-foot diameter domes is being proposed currently. Those could scale up to 500-foot domes, which may seem absolutely insane because that's 4.5 acres inside of one dome, but it is a doable structure. There are some comparables that are on the planet that have been constructed quite easily, and so this could get much bigger. But for the purpose of getting these deployed quickly, there are kits you can buy that are 120-foot diameter kits. They can be deployed in a week and anchored. Of course, you have all kinds of logistics. I mean, you have to work through the utility delivery, the restrooms, all kinds of emergency access and flow, and deliverable of materials in and out of the spaces. So there's a lot to this, but for the purpose of selecting a structure that's very replicatable, structurally engineered, blah, 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 120 foot. That provides 10,400 square feet inside each of the 3 domes, of which there are 3. And they are a 60-foot elevation gain, assuming they're not built on top of something that provides more elevation gain, meaning you were to excavate down on one side. You want to make sure water can exit the space and build up on another side and then elevate the dome, so that would give you a taller structure. Because they're structurally engineered and stamped, they're very easy to acquire and build. They would be built out of a twin-wall polycarbonate material as their unique interface to the outside. That allows for thermal regulation, air conditioning, and heating, but also for light transmission so that the gardens grow well and there's ample light coming into the space. Now, we would want to temper that in the performance spaces and certainly in the unique Adventure Series space, which may not be a dome. It may be a different type of building that fits into the overall aesthetic. But for the purpose of getting 3 domes in, this is what would work. The new anchoring system that we have has been permitted and approved in the mock-up project, which exists. I'll talk about that in a moment. So that anchoring system is brand new. We engineered it together with a firm so that it could go in without putting in concrete pylons. It was tested by Atlas Engineering, which is the engineering firm here in Boise that does all the testing for the city and for surrounding areas for the most part, and all kinds of other things, and provides an enormous amount of upward support. So the nice thing about this new anchoring system is it can be removed. So if there's some reason why this utterly failed and there was no cost to the county or anyone, we could take this out and free up those 10 acres. I think that's a very unlikely situation, but I plan for eventualities regardless. So all these comparables that I've done for the math are available online. Most of them are 501c3s, for example, botanical gardens. So you can go out and you can look at your own estimates. I very much encourage you to be careful when you do that because you will see enormous numbers there and might get you overly excited. I think that, like I mentioned, some of these pull in $300 million a year in the botanical garden side. That is highly disproportionate. They have been around for a very long time. They are in big population bases that involve a lot of tourism. So please do not look at those with the same type of equation. You have to scale those down. All the estimates here are highly conservative for that reason. We also didn't add any grants, donations, or alternative income projections. Those are very likely to occur, and therefore they would add quite substantially to the net benefit, the income for this, but we didn't put them in. And the reason is they're variables. I can't guarantee a grant or a donation of any kind, therefore it's not helpful to put it in the math. I would rather this stand on its own and show that it's an extraordinarily good income stream without any help, and then have a whole bunch come in and be even happier. Because the community will benefit. Again, all this needs to go right back out into the community in some way, whether that's granting new ideas or bolstering other programs, specifically helping Expo Idaho as they might desire, and paying for the park. So it's highly community involved. We've had a nonprofit around for 8 years that does this. So when I say there's a mock-up of this, it exists already. We have a 44-foot biodome already. It is a tropical garden. It's in the process of being built. The big Fabergé egg you saw in some of these pictures is at layer 5 of 12 of construction. So that's also already being built, and it will be layered with over 100,000 LEDs. So this isn't a pie in the sky thing that we don't know how to do. All of it's been done before, and we've built this mock-up at our own expense in order for people to see it work. So we already have a plan. We already have some very strong community involvement for 8 years. It's getting quite much more people coming in over the last few years since COVID sort of has been tapering off. A ton more people have been coming in. And that's really encouraging because it means these spaces will do well. It's also, the current one is run by an existing nonprofit. Now, we believe that what should happen with this new one is that the nonprofit that goes in should be an existing nonprofit, and that's for the reason of pursuing certain funding. You have to be around for 3 years to do some of that in some cases. And then a new organizational structure should be made around the Gardens of Xanadu or GoX Project. And the reason for that is to bring in new people with a vested interest that really love this idea and want to be involved. It's an entirely new project, therefore a new team, and it should be transitioned in. We think a B Corp might be a good idea in addition to a nonprofit. They both have benefits. The benefit of a B Corp is it allows you to pay your people a little bit higher. We think we really value people, and if there's a lot of money coming in, we think people that are running the space should be paid appropriately. If you happen to be the kids director or the education director or the gardens director or the performance, whatever, or performance or even security or whatever people are doing. If there's money coming in, we want this organization to be a model of well-paid people that are happy and love what they do. And we believe a B Corp would solve that because it also prevents that money from being siphoned up to the top people and just taken out of the organization. because it's a public benefit corporation, meaning all that money needs to benefit the public in some way. Separate LLCs should be done for the retail, for the coffee, wine, beer, and restaurant spaces, but they should be part of the space. Their goal should be contributing back to the parent organization, but they should be run separately. People who know how to run a coffee shop should run a coffee shop. People that know how to run a restaurant shouldn't be interfered with by people running the gardens. So there's some separation there for that reason, and it does some limited liability protections against people in those spaces against the larger project, which is smart. So I hope this helps answer some of the lingering questions, where we're at and where we intend to go. Again, this is all contingent on hoping that the commissioners and the Expo Idaho and Port and the project managers and everybody involved in this project that's nurtured this thing along for years will be enamored with this, will see the benefit to it, and will avail themselves of this opportunity because, again, it's intended to be really a help. It's intended to come in and bolster everything and make this succeed in the best way possible. With all of that said, I encourage you to ask questions, to reach out, and to get involved as much as you'd like. The best way to get involved now is to voice your opinion. If you don't like it, if you see some shortfalls, or if you love it, you could let the commissioners know, because it is difficult to convey. When I say community a lot, which I do use a lot, what does that really mean? How many people, and who really, thinks about this and that kind of stuff. So commissioners might need to hear that for their own benefit, because then they know this is truly something that they should consider, and not just a small, group of people that are going to benefit from this. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to future updates. And more importantly, I look forward to a future where this is deployed.